As often as we read history books, sometimes we discover that authors have difficulty with communicating historical details. I had a bit of reservations about that when I approached this book. I knew that the War of 1812 is not a simple matter. It's complex. And toss in the Creek War of 1813 and 1814, left me with some curiosity and wonderment at how Kilmeade and Yeager would treat this book. To my surprise and delight, perhaps to you as well, I thought this was a well-written narrative of this book. It is a powerful narrative. Sometimes it's a bit choppy and plods along as it gives an analysis of the contextual events, but overall it's captivating. Very captivating. It's detailed when telling the story about the battle. I don't know how many of you stuck it through it. As you were reading about the battle, there's a lot of details. I did. I made it through it. It took me I think overall about 3 days to read this book. I think it really helped that the print is not really small, and there's a lot of space. And as I'm still a baby in this room, but I'm discovering how important that is when you're reading. At the beginning of the book, Yeager and Kilmeade open up by tracing his background with, I thought, a well-done overview of the Revolutionary War encounter with a British officer, his epic duel with the Bentons in Nashville, and his journey to and from Natchez, where eventually, he earned the nickname, what is it? What's his nickname? Old Hickory. Everyone, you knew that, right? Old Hickory. Kilmeade and Yeager also move rapidly through all of Andrew Jackson's Creek War encounters and touched on on all of them, the major encounters that led up to the Battle of New Orleans. But it really shined when Yeager and Kilmeade arrived at the description of the fight with the British at New Orleans. Their narrative of multiple encounters which comprise the New Orleans campaign are, I think, some of the best I've ever read. I enjoy reading James Michener books. Perhaps you do too. I didn't get lost, nor did I get bored with reading this. I stayed with it. Their writing was succinct and compelling, and they provided stirring accounts of the gallant defense of Fort Boyer. Is that how it's pronounced? Is that how you would pronounce it? Near Mobile by outnumbered forces. His capture, Jackson's capture of Pensacola, that was held by the Spanish. You remember that battle? And the probably forgotten, I didn't know they had a navy back in those days except for the British, the pitched naval engagement at Lake Bourne, which eventually shaped and formed the British landing on the American mainland. Every once in a while in the book, Kilmeade and Yeager pause to talk about the treaty. Do you recall that discussion? Every once in a while they jump back and forth to examine the negotiations about the treaty which would end the war, and I think to emphasize home the point that although the battle was fought technically after the treaty was signed, it's clear that if the British had have captured New Orleans, they wouldn't have simply returned it to the United States. So accomplishing victory was imperative for Jackson, both for the salvation of New Orleans, and I think the people there who lived there knew that, and eventually for the future of the United States. But one of the highlights of the book, another highlight of the book for me is Kilmeade's and Yeager's treatment of Jackson's leadership. Amazing leader. Amazing leader. He had a lot of warts. He struggled with poor health. I couldn't imagine how he did these things with the details that Kilmeade and Yeager described about Jackson's difficult health issues. But more than that, he pulled together an army, a very diverse army of people. I think I was mentioning to Willie earlier, we were talking about, Willie brought it up, and we were talking about the diversity. And he even pulled in the pirates in New Orleans with Jean Lafitte. And was largely untrained, untested in comparison to the mighty British Army. Jackson deserves a lot of praise for this. He really does. And then his leadership in the battle, such as, you remember the first battle where he attacked the British at night. Once he learned where they had landed and they'd camped out, he went right at them. And that was a very successful battle. It probably bought the Americans time to regroup. It slowed or stopped the British Army from advancing for a while, toward New Orleans, which was an unprotected city. And then his decisive military strategy lured the British into a very bloody battle, which the British lost in in dramatic fashion. And somehow, I was curious about this too, I don't know if you noticed this, how Jackson kept his position. He never left his position. He pulled the British toward him, and that's where he just destroyed the army. I wondered what would have happened if he had left the position and went out and pursued the British. He may not have won the battle, having done so. Jackson's planning was not without flaws. He was perfect. He wasn't perfect. Kilmeade and Yeager point out. They discuss the potentially disastrous British assault on the American position opposite the Mississippi River from Chalmette. But with the overwhelming victory on January the 8th, 1815, by that resolute and ragtag army, the British invaders had no choice but to retreat back to their ships. You recall at the end of the story how even though the treaty had been signed, the battle was over, Jackson didn't believe it. He wouldn't let the people go out. He had curfew instilled in the city for a long time, and people were, the merchants were getting upset at him for, hey, wait a minute, we won the battle, what's the problem? But he didn't trust the British people, the British army. He wanted to make sure that the battle was over and they were said and gone. And I think too, at the very end of the book, Admiral Cochrane was still pursuing the battle further until the battle eventually ended, and the city of New Orleans celebrated with Jackson their victory. I didn't realize when Ann brought this to me what this topic would bring. I didn't realize how near and dear it was to my heart. Even though I'm not a history buff, but I recognized how crucial Jackson's leadership was, and that the victory in New Orleans was to this nation. I think it was probably the finest military hour of the United States of America, and it happened when? Back in 1815. So, you don't think about this battle when you're thinking about World War II, World War I. I mean, it's back there. But it also brought Jackson to national acclaim, and I believe it set him up for his two-term presidency and his influence over a time which would forever be known as Yeager and Kilmeade say, the age of Andrew Jackson. This book is refreshing. I appreciate especially that in history, I don't know if Andrew Jackson gets a fair treatment. I think people find more wrong with Andrew Jackson than they found right. So one of the things I appreciate about this book is that Kilmeade and Yeager highlight this man's leadership. And one of our country's most important battles. Yes, he had faults, and people may want to highlight them, but maybe the next book ought to be written, The Hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, and that they have given us a chance to celebrate his successes and ultimately his victory. Thank you very much. So what was your favorite part of the book? What did you enjoy the most?
I enjoyed seeing the ragtag crew of all different types that he dragged into this.
Me too.
Jean Lafitte, he didn't even want to have him in there because he's a total creep, but realized he was a good strategic total creep.
He was. He needed it. He needed it. And if I remember correctly, Lafitte knew New Orleans. He knew the topography inside and out, and he had men and he had ammunition, which I don't think Jackson had a lot. Robert.
Well, I didn't enjoy it, but I was learned and was shocked by back in 1815 the sheer power that Britain projected. I mean, it reminded me more of, Star Wars of the Rebel Alliance having to fight against the Empire. I mean, the mismatch in numbers, between the Americans and the British. I mean, the number of ships that they had, and the number of naval forces, and the number of people that they had ready to land in boats and
take over,
and how the boats that Jackson's men could hope to do was to kind of delay them a little bit and, with a few ships and snipe at them a little bit. But I mean, they were just massively outnumbered. It was just it really was a miracle, and it was like, for all the wisdom and smarts of the British general, was it Admiral Cochrane or whatever, that in the final defeat, that one battle, that final assault where they just were able to snipe away and kill an inordinate number of redcoats, like he made a dumb mistake to attack at a point where they had an advantage and were had clear shots at them, and the loss was so great. It was similar in the Revolutionary War to the Battle of Kings Mountain in North Carolina, South Carolina, where the British sent an organized troop against some ragtag resistors back in 1781. Mm-hmm. And again, the losses were so great that they had the power to keep projecting more people they could have, but after all, I mean, they're wealthy, civilized people, a nation, and they said, this ain't worth it. This is, the cost is too much. We're just not going to keep pouring, all this in. But they had the wealth.
They did.
That was the other thing. They had the wealth to be able to put that many ships at sea for a military fighting. That was just stunning to me. I had no idea.
It's stunning. You look at all those details that you just reviewed, and more that's in the book.
Yeah.
They should have won.
Yeah.
They should have won.
Well, after all, in 1812, they sailed up the Potomac and burned the Capitol,
They did. That was at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like, why didn't they just, take it back? It looked like they were about to take the country back, really.
Yes, yes.
When I think of battles that took place in 1815, The first battle that comes to mind is the Battle of Waterloo.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and this battle here would be the second on your
Of
on
course.
your list, so to speak. You know, you wouldn't think of that,
Oh, yeah.
but
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about, for me was Jackson's faith. I don't know if you picked up, it wasn't a heavily focused topic or theme, but Jackson did have a faith. And you remember when he was in New Orleans, the nuns, was it the Ursuline nuns, who gathered in a chapel and were praying, nonstop for Jackson, and how at the very end of the battle, he went and thanked the nuns for their perseverance in praying for him, because he really believed that this miracle happened. It couldn't have happened without God's divine intervention. I mean, that was mentioned in this book from time to time. Kilmeade and Yeager didn't treat it in a heavy way, but they inserted it. They put it in there. That was a piece that got my attention. Now, I like pictures. I don't know about you, but I thought this was nice too. The pictures in the middle of the book. That helped. There's a grand picture of Jackson dressed in his regalia, and even I think a picture of his bride in here somewhere. And others, John Coffey, General John Coffey, Battle of Baltimore, what happened at the Battle of Baltimore? Do you remember? He talked about it.
Francis Scott Key.
Francis Scott Key. Now, wasn't that a nice reminder? Key. Yes, ma'am.
He had to be well known for as many men to come from all over the country as they did. How did they know him? I mean, we didn't have
Folklore.
folklore.
Folklore about who he really was. I mean, there was probably some embellishment there. Now, who is this man called Jackson, and the battles that he had won?
And they came from everywhere.
Yeah.
Down from Tennessee and Kentucky and all the others.
Oh, yeah. Davy Crockett, I think, is even mentioned in this story somewhere, right? That was Sam Houston. Sam Houston. So, us San Antonio people, we know those names. And we're going, whoa, okay, now we see some connections here, But I think that's part of the familiarity. I think it took some time for Washington, the government. Who was Madison? Was it Madison the president at the time? And the Secretary of War, to really catch on who this guy named Jackson really was, and to trust him. I mean, there was a trust relationship that was happening, and they didn't have one of these say, hey, they're writing letters. And you had to be a darn good letter writer, I mean, what was it, a week ago we were remembering George H.W. Bush and his gift of writing letters to Barbara. You had to be a clear communicator. And then the people who transmitted the letters, the couriers, you might not make it to your place, you've got to, you're the mail carrier. Any other comments, questions that you have?
Scott, I found it interesting. I was not a model history student.
Join with you.
And I was shocked that the War of 1812 didn't end in 1812.
No.
And so that was interesting. It was kind of like the trick question that they put on who won the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
Either one of them, but
Yeah.
the Americans.
Yeah, last night I was helping Zachary with, he had his last final exam today, and it was in poli-sci, went into history. and the professor apparently lets them use cheat sheets. You get to form your own cheat sheet in a prescribed piece of paper. In this case, it was an 8.5 by 11. She's only given them half that amount, and you can pack everything you want on there. And the tiniest of writing, Zach can't write as tiny as I can. I guess I've got engineering in me, and I just write really tiny. Can you read that, son? Can you read that? And you had to turn it into her after you were done, and she would burn it or shred it, but it was definitions. Just, 40 or 50 definitions. And by the time Zach had taken all these tests and he'd arrived at the final, he knew most of those words. And so he was building a file for me, and he was on one computer and I was on my computer sitting in another desk. And he would transmit, and I could see we're working on Google Docs, so we both could be on the same document. So I like to pull jokes on Zach, and he likes to pull them on me too. And I type, he was typing all these long definitions, so I typed in, "Who is buried in Lincoln's tomb?" And he sat there for a little bit, and he goes, "Dad, that's a trick question." And I go, "Well, what do you think?" We had to laugh and all that seriousness because it's just too serious.
I was very intrigued by what terrible shape Jackson was in. He was really old and really worn out, and got more and more worn out, and would stay up all nights or give himself 2 hours of sleep or something.
Here or there.
And but he just was driven from his inner gut by what he knew needed to happen, what he knew was right.
Exactly.
And we need more people who are driven by their inner gut.
Well, especially
on
today.
what really is true and what's really right.
Right.
And not just voting on the internet.
That's right, exactly. At the very beginning of the book, and I don't know much about this, maybe some of you are better at this, but the story where Jackson's family was basically destroyed, killed, and it leaves you hanging. He wants to get revenge. So it kind of, in the prologue, it's sort of the Great Britain. Here's the last paragraph of the prologue. Andy wouldn't forget her advice, and he would take care to settle more than just slander. Great Britain had left him an orphan, and one day he would settle that score. I don't know if Kilmeade and Yeager chased that argument down very well in the book. I don't know if that's ultimately what I'm trying to track a little bit with your comment. If that was his driving force, what was the drive for Jackson in the midst of his poor health? I suppose that's one thing. If an army killed your family, you'd be angry. So anger probably is one of those things. But they really didn't focus on that. Did you feel they did?
I just felt the focus within him.
Yeah.
And if you want to win, don't instill that kind of drive in somebody. Maybe pamby it a little bit, but then you can sneak around on the back. But if you get them just dug in that deep.
Yeah.
I got the impression that some of his motivation came from his men that were under him. He was so awed and bowled over really by their zeal and their desire to do it, that and part of it was maintaining faith with them, in spite of discouraging circumstances and having to make a retreat at one point. And, here all these people had given up a lot to come and be in this army, and they were so loyal that here was a man of wealth, actually, and apparently educated. He knew the right stuff. If anybody has ever visited the Hermitage, the name of his home in Tennessee near Nashville, it's an extremely elegant place, and is thanks to the history and it's better. When I visited in 1953, it was nice then, but it's even better now. In 2001, I sent my wife and one of my daughters on a drive across country. They were delivering a car to Carolyn up in New Jersey, and I said, you gotta go through Nashville and see the Hermitage. And they brought home a brochure, and I thought, wow, they have really fixed this place up. And that's the great thing about our country. National historical landmarks have not only been preserved, but they have a lot of other materials that really show them off at their best. It's just, it's really great. But the contrast between the wealth and the privilege of the man with his commitment and compassion for people that were poor and were giving up everything of what little they had to fight the cause. He was really moved by that, and it really formed, I think, his political philosophy as later on, as president of the country.
His relationships with these men who he served with, and at the very end of it's a great comment, Robert. You remember at the very end of the book, when he finally went back to the Hermitage, who went with him? His men. They escorted him all the way back to the front door of his house. Why? Because they loved him. They respected him. I mean, this was an amazing, amazing leader. And I think that spoke volumes about him. So.
Did anybody here, several years ago at the San Antonio Museum of Art, they had an exhibit by one of our early American artists, Thomas Sully, and he had wonderful paintings of the prominent people from the early 1800s and maybe late 1700s, I'm not sure which, but one of his most famous ones was the portrait of Jackson that is the basis for the $20 bill, that picture. I mean, you got to see, the actual painting by Thomas Sully on display over here at Salmon on that of this painting that was exactly that picture in color, of Jackson. It's really very special.
Well, Ann, thanks for asking me. I am honored. Thank you for having me today, and ask me again. I'll come back.
Try and find a dog book for you.
All right. I know there'll be one.
I know.
I think Susie has taught me, so if it's a cat book, I'll do a cat book.
Oh, would you? They're not as popular as dog books.
No, they're not.
I found that.
We've got 4 cats at our house, so and 2 dogs. So we've got a lot of furry friends. But thank you all for
Whichever way it'll be categorized, dogmatic.
That's right.